James, a quiet veteran who had seen his share of struggles, always believed in the power of resilience. One fateful day, an unexpected encounter in a local diner leads him down a path he never anticipated. When a diner owner unjustly kicks him out simply for being black, a group of bikers witnesses the event and decides to take a stand. As they rally around James, the repercussions of this moment unfold in ways that change the course of their lives forever. Why did standing up for a veteran spark such intense reactions? How did this act of solidarity expose deep-seated issues and ignite a movement in their community? Stay tuned to discover the transformative power of compassion and the courage to confront injustice. And before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if this story of unity and bravery resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. James Thompson was a man who carried his years with quiet dignity. At 89, his body had begun to slow, but his spirit remained resolute. His dark, weathered skin bore the marks of a life lived through hardship, but his sharp brown eyes, though softened with age, still held the wisdom of a man who had seen far too much. He stood a little shorter than he once had, his back slightly hunched from years of labor, but James always held his head high. He was a black man who had fought battles, both on and off the battlefield, and he had learned to endure. James had grown up in a time when segregation was the law, and though much had changed since then, some things hadn't changed enough. As a young man, he had enlisted in the military and served his country during World War II. It was an experience that had left an indelible mark on him, not just because of the war, but because of the way he was treated by his own countrymen. He had fought bravely, alongside men who looked nothing like him, only to return home to a nation that still saw him as less than. The promise of freedom and equality he had defended overseas was denied to him in his own land. After the war, James settled in a small town. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, but being known didn't always mean being accepted. He had spent his years working quietly, doing odd jobs here and there, never asking for much. He had seen enough of life to know that expecting more often led to disappointment. The years passed, and though he had outlived most of his friends and family, James never felt lonely. He had his routine, and that was enough for him. Every morning, without fail, James walked to the same diner on the corner of Main Street. It was a modest place, nothing fancy, but it served good, hearty meals. He would arrive just as the sun was climbing in the sky, the crisp morning air a reminder that he was still alive, still moving forward, no matter what life had thrown at him. His steps were slow but steady, each one a testament to his resilience. The town had come to recognize James, though most people only knew him as the old man. He wasn't a man who drew attention to himself. He wore the same worn jacket every day, a cap pulled low over his head, and he always greeted people with a polite nod. But for all the familiarity, there was an unspoken distance. James was never truly part of the town's fabric. There was always an air of indifference toward him, sometimes even something colder, though most people wouldn't say it out loud. He could feel it in the way people looked through him rather than at him, or how they stepped aside without acknowledgement. The small-town racism was subtle but persistent. No outright confrontations, just the quiet reminders that he didn't quite belong. The younger generation, in particular, seemed to view him with a mixture of disregard and discomfort. Maybe they sensed the weight of his years, or maybe it was something else. Whatever the case, James had learned not to let it bother him. The diner James frequented was owned by Ron Walters, a man who had lived in the town his entire life. Ron was in his late 50s, a gruff man with thick arms and a permanent scowl. He had taken over the diner from his father years ago and ran it with the same attitude he had grown up with. Ron tolerated James' presence, but never went out of his way to make him feel welcome. If anything, there was always a simmering resentment in the way Ron served him. Quick, curt, and without a word more than necessary. Ron's racism wasn't the kind that exploded in public. It was more insidious, lurking beneath the surface of every interaction. He didn't need to say much. The way he slammed the coffee cup down on the table when James ordered, the sneer he tried to hide behind a neutral expression, these were the signs. But James, always the gentleman, never let it show that he noticed. He had been through too much in life to let a man like Ron get under his skin. Still, James could feel it. Every time he walked through the door, there was a slight tension in the air, a sense that he wasn't truly wanted. And yet he kept coming. It wasn't out of defiance. James wasn't one for confrontation. He came because it was his routine, it was part of his day, and he wasn't about to change that for anyone. On this particular morning, as James made his way to the diner, something felt different. The town seemed busier than usual. Cars lined the streets, and there were more people milling about than he was accustomed to seeing. When he approached the diner, he could see that it was fuller than it had been in a long time. The usual quiet hum of the place was replaced with the chatter of customers, the clatter of plates and silverware, and the scraping of chairs as people settled in for breakfast. James pushed the door open and stepped inside. For a moment, the noise seemed to die down as people turned to look at him. It wasn't uncommon for folks to notice when he walked in. An old black man in a predominantly white town stood out, even if he had been doing the same thing for years. But today, the stares lingered a little longer, and the silence stretched just a bit too far. James nodded to a few familiar faces, but the responses were muted. He made his way to his usual table in the back corner, the one where he could sit quietly and enjoy his breakfast in peace. Ron was behind the counter, wiping down a few dishes. He glanced up when James entered, his eyes narrowing slightly. The diner owner was more agitated than usual, and as James sat down, he could feel Ron's gaze burning into him from across the room. Something was off. James could sense it. The waitress, a young woman named Lisa, approached his table hesitantly. She had always been polite to James, though never particularly warm. Today, though, there was a noticeable tension in her demeanor. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice quiet. "What can I get for you?" James smiled softly, his voice calm and steady. "Just the usual, thank you. Black coffee and 2 eggs, over easy." Lisa nodded quickly and hurried off to the kitchen, her shoulders stiff. James watched her go, feeling the eyes of the other patrons still on him. He tried to ignore it, turning his attention to the window beside his table, watching the world outside move on as it always did. A few minutes later, Lisa returned with his coffee, setting it down carefully in front of him. But before she could bring his food, Ron walked over, wiping his hands on a towel. His heavy boots thudded against the floor, and his face was set in a deep frown. He stopped just short of James' table, his arms crossed over his chest. "James," Ron said, his voice low but carrying an edge, "I think it's about time we had a little talk." James looked up from his coffee, meeting Ron's gaze. There was something in the way Ron was standing, a stiffness that told James this wasn't going to be just a casual conversation. "What's on your mind, Ron?" James asked, his tone as polite as ever. Ron glanced around the diner, making sure everyone was watching, before turning his attention back to James. His voice was louder now, enough for the nearby tables to hear. "You've been coming here for a long time, James," Ron began, his words slow and deliberate. "But I think it's about time you found someplace else to eat." A heavy silence fell over the room. James felt the weight of every eye on him, the curious stares, the quiet anticipation of what would come next. "I've never caused any trouble here, Ron," James said, his voice measured. "I just come in, have my breakfast, and go on my way." Ron's scowl deepened. "It's not about trouble. It's about who I want in my diner. And today, I've decided I don't want you here anymore." The words hung in the air, sharp and cruel. James felt the familiar sting of humiliation, but he didn't flinch. He had faced worse than this in his life, and he wasn't about to let a man like Ron break his composure. "I see," James said quietly. "I suppose that you're right." Ron smirked, clearly satisfied with himself. "Damn right it is. So why don't you finish that coffee and get on out of here?" James didn't respond immediately. He took a slow sip of his coffee, savoring the bitter warmth. He knew what was happening here. Ron wasn't just throwing him out. He was making an example of him, reminding everyone in that diner who had the power. But James wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of a scene. He nodded once, set his coffee cup down, and slowly pushed his chair back. Without a word, James stood and made his way toward the door, the eyes of the diner following his every step. As he reached for the handle, he paused for a moment, glancing back at Ron. Their eyes met, And for a brief second, James saw something flicker in Ron's gaze. Something like uncertainty. But it passed as quickly as it had come. James stepped outside, the cool morning air hitting his face as he closed the door behind him. Inside the diner, the tension remained thick, but James didn't look back. He had learned long ago that looking back never did much good. The next morning, the sky was painted with soft hues of orange and pink, the kind of sunrise that usually brought a quiet peace to James Thompson's heart. But after the previous day's events, there was a heaviness in his chest. He had been humiliated, and though he had faced worse in his life, something about this cut deeper. Perhaps it was the blatant disrespect, or maybe it was the fact that even at 89, after all the battles he had fought, both literal and figurative, he still had to face this kind of ugliness. Still, he would not let it break him. He had learned to weather storms, and this was just another one. After all, his routine was his routine, and he wasn't about to let a man like Ron Walters take that from him. James walked his usual path to the diner, his steps slower than usual, each footfall feeling heavier than the last. His mind wandered back to the faces he had seen in the diner yesterday, the uncomfortable glances, the averted eyes. No one had stood up for him, but he hadn't expected them to. They had their own lives, their own prejudices, their own fears. He had learned long ago not to rely on others to fight his battles for him. As he approached the diner, he hesitated for a brief moment outside the door. The voices from inside floated out into the crisp morning air, the clatter of plates and silverware mixing with the hum of conversation. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and pushed the door open. The familiar bell jingled, announcing his arrival, and once again, the conversations inside died down. All eyes turned toward him, the same way they always did, but today, there was a different energy in the room. It was tense, expectant, as if everyone knew what was about to happen but didn't want to be a part of it. James walked to his usual table in the back, the one by the window where he could sit quietly and watch the world outside. He settled into his seat, the worn leather of the booth creaking beneath him. He kept his eyes forward, not looking at anyone, but he could feel their stares. Ron was behind the counter, his broad figure moving slowly as he wiped down the counter with a rag. His eyes followed James from the moment he entered, narrowing with disdain. He tossed the rag aside and walked out from behind the counter, making his way toward James with heavy, deliberate steps. The diner grew quieter with each step Ron took, the low murmur of conversations fading into an uncomfortable silence. When he reached James' table, Ron stood there for a moment, looking down at the old man with a sneer. "Back again, huh?" Ron's voice was loud, louder than it needed to be, as if he wanted everyone in the room to hear. "You must not have heard me yesterday." James looked up slowly, meeting Ron's gaze with calm, steady eyes. "I heard you, Ron," he said quietly, "but I've been coming here for years. I've never caused any trouble." Ron's lip curled into a smirk. "It's not about trouble, James. It's about your kind. I told you, you're not welcome here anymore." The words hung in the air like a foul stench, and the room seemed to grow colder. A few of the other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing toward the door as if they were suddenly contemplating an early exit. Others avoided looking at the scene entirely, staring down at their plates or out the window, pretending they weren't witnessing the exchange. James held Ron's gaze for a moment before speaking. "My kind?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. Ron leaned in closer, his face inches from James. "Yeah, you're kind. I've put up with it long enough. You people always think you can just come in here, sit wherever you want, and act like you belong." James felt a familiar sting in his chest, a sharp ache that had nothing to do with his age. It was the same ache he had felt years ago, when he had come back from the war, only to be told he couldn't sit at the same counter as the men he had fought alongside. It was the same ache he had felt every time he had been turned away, every time he had been looked at like he didn't belong. But James didn't let it show. He wouldn't give Ron the satisfaction. Instead, he straightened in his seat, his eyes never leaving Ron's. "I fought for this country, Ron," James said, his voice steady. "I fought for the right to sit here, just like anyone else." Ron let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, that was a long time ago. Things are different now. And I'm telling you, I don't want you here. The tension in the diner was thick enough to cut with a knife. James could feel the eyes of the other customers on him, watching, waiting to see what he would do. He knew what Ron was trying to do. He was trying to provoke him, trying to get a rise out of him. But James had lived long enough to know that reacting with anger wouldn't change anything. It would only make things worse. So, he stayed calm. "I'm not here to cause any trouble, Ron," James said quietly. "I just want to have my breakfast." Ron's eyes darkened, his face twisting with anger. "I don't care what you want, old man. I said get out." He stepped closer to James, towering over him now, his fists clenched at his sides. The room seemed to hold its breath. James looked up at him, his expression calm but tired. "Is that how it is then?" Ron leaned down, his voice a low growl. "That's exactly how it is. I don't need people like you in here bringing down my business." James could feel the hurt building in his chest, but he swallowed it down. He had faced men like Ron before, men who thought they were better than him because of the color of their skin. But James had survived them all, and he would survive this too. Without a word, James began to rise from his seat. He moved slowly, his body stiff with age, but his movements were deliberate. He didn't want to make a scene, but he wasn't going to let Ron push him around either. As he stood, Ron took a step back, folding his arms over his chest with a smug look of satisfaction on his face. "That's right. Walk on out of here. Go find some place that actually wants you around." James stood tall, his back straight, his eyes meeting Ron's with quiet strength. "You know, Ron," he said softly, "I've seen men like you before. Full of hate, full of anger. But that doesn't make you strong. It just makes you small." For a moment, Ron's smirk faltered. His jaw tightened, and the muscles in his neck tensed. He took another step forward, his face flushing with anger. "You think you're better than me, old man? You think because you fought in some war, you can talk to me like that?" James didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was in his eyes, in the way he stood, unshaken by Ron's rage. The diner was silent. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire room was frozen in time, waiting for what would happen next. Ron's voice rose, loud and venomous. "I said get out. You old fool. Take your high and mighty attitude and get the hell out of my diner." James could feel the stares burning into his back, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. But he didn't let it break him. He had lived through worse. He would live through this. He turned toward the door, his steps slow but steady, his head held high. He didn't look back at Ron. He didn't need to. He knew what he would see. A man consumed by his own hatred, lashing out at the world because he couldn't face his own insecurities. As James reached the door, he heard a voice from behind him, soft, hesitant, but unmistakable. "Mr. Thompson, wait." He stopped, his hand on the door handle, and turned to see Lisa, the young waitress, standing a few feet away. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her order pad to her chest. She hesitated, glancing at Ron, who glared at her with open hostility. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson. You don't deserve this." Her words were barely above a whisper, but they carried weight. In the silence of the diner, they echoed like a shout. James smiled softly, his eyes kind but tired. "It's all right, Lisa," he said gently. "It's not your fault." Ron sneered, stepping toward her. "You'd better mind your own business, Lisa. This doesn't concern you." But Lisa didn't back down. For the first time since James had known her, she stood up to Ron, her voice shaking but determined. "It's wrong, Ron. What you're doing, it's wrong." Ron's face twisted with rage. "You want to lose your job, girl? Because that's what's going to happen if you keep running your mouth." Lisa's lip quivered, but she didn't move. She didn't speak again, but the message was clear. She wasn't going to let Ron bully her into silence. James nodded to her, a silent thank you, before turning and had been moments away from leaving the diner for what felt like the last time. His heart was heavy with the weight of Ron's cruel words, but his mind was calm. He had weathered the storm once more, just as he had done so many times before. But as he reached for the door handle, ready to step out, something unexpected happened. The low, rumbling sound of motorcycles filled the air. It started faint, just a distant vibration, but it grew louder with every second. James paused, his hand on the door, and turned slightly to look out the window. The rest of the diner patrons shifted in their seats as well, curiosity piqued by the approaching roar. The noise grew deafening, and then, through the window, James saw them. A group of bikers, 5, maybe 6, rode up to the diner on their gleaming motorcycles. They wore leather jackets, emblazoned with patches and symbols, their helmets glinting in the morning sun. They were an imposing sight, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere inside. The bikes pulled up right in front of the diner, and one by one, the riders killed their engines. The rumbling faded into silence, replaced by the soft, ticking sound of cooling metal. James watched as the men dismounted their bikes, their boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. They moved with purpose, like they had seen their fair share of battles and weren't afraid of walking into another one. The door to the diner swung open with a creak as the bikers entered. They were big men, tall and broad-shouldered, their faces weathered and hardened by years of life on the road. At the front of the group was a man who looked to be in his late 40s, his hair graying at the temples, his jaw square and set with determination. His leather jacket bore the name Tom stitched onto a small patch over his heart, and the emblem of a veterans motorcycle club was emblazoned on his back. The room went silent as the bikers stepped inside. The customers who had been quietly eating their breakfast now stared wide-eyed, unsure of what to expect. Even Ron, who had been smugly watching James prepare to leave, froze at the sight of the newcomers. Tom's eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene in front of him. His gaze landed on James, who was still standing by the door, his shoulders slightly slumped from the weight of the morning's events. Then, Tom's eyes moved to Ron, who stood behind the counter, his arms folded across his chest, a look of irritation slowly creeping across his face. The two men locked eyes, and something shifted in the room. "Can I help you?" Ron asked, his voice clipped, as if he was already bracing for trouble. Tom didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward, his boots echoing on the diner's floor. The rest of the bikers followed behind him, their silent presence enough to make the other customers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "We're just here for some breakfast," Tom finally said, his voice low and steady, though there was a hint of something more behind his words, something that made everyone in the diner sit up a little straighter. "But it looks like we walked in on something." An older woman who was quietly watching the confrontation and was disgusted by Ron's behavior decided to fill in Tom about what exactly happened before he walked in the diner. Ron's eyes flickered toward James, then back to Tom. His posture stiffened, as if he was trying to decide how to handle the situation. "This is between me and him," Ron said, nodding toward James without even bothering to use his name. "It's none of your business." Tom's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. He took another step forward, closing the distance between himself and Ron. "See, that's where you're wrong," he said. "It is my business." The air in the diner felt thick with tension, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. James, who had been watching the exchange with quiet surprise, remained where he was, unsure of what to say or do. Tom gestured toward James with a nod of his head. "This man, this veteran, deserves respect. You're standing there, throwing insults at him like he's nothing, but I see him for what he really is. A man who's served his country, who's earned his place in this world. And you think you can talk to him like that?" Ron's face reddened. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to being challenged in his own diner. "I have the right to refuse service to anyone I want," he snapped, his voice rising with frustration. "It's my diner. I can do what I want." Tom's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. Instead, he took another step forward, his eyes locked on Ron's. "Let me ask you something," Tom said quietly, but there was a sharp edge to his words. "Did you serve?" Ron blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What?" he muttered, clearly confused. "Did you serve?" Tom repeated, his voice a little louder this time. "Did you ever put on a uniform, stand next to your brothers, and fight for something bigger than yourself?" Ron's mouth opened, but no words came out. He glanced around the diner, as if searching for support, but found none. The other customers remained silent, watching the exchange with wide eyes. Tom took another step forward, now standing directly in front of Ron. "Because I did," he continued, his voice steady. "And so did he." He pointed toward James, who was still standing quietly by the door. "And when you insult him, when you treat him like he's less than, you're insulting every man and woman who's ever served." The other bikers stood behind Tom, their faces set in grim expressions. They didn't need to say anything. Their presence alone was enough to make it clear where they stood. Ron's face twisted with anger. "You think you can come in here and tell me how to run my diner?" He spat, his voice trembling with rage. "I don't owe him anything. He's just some old man who—" "That's enough." Tom cut him off, his voice low but firm. "You don't have to like him. You don't have to agree with him. But you will respect him." Ron opened his mouth to argue, but the words seemed to die in his throat. He was outnumbered, outmatched, and he knew it. His eyes darted toward the bikers, then back to Tom, who was still standing inches away from him, unflinching. For a long moment, the diner was silent. The tension in the air was so thick it was almost suffocating. Everyone was waiting, waiting to see what Ron would do, waiting to see if Tom's words would sink in. Finally, Ron let out a sharp breath, his shoulders sagging with defeat. He stepped back away from Tom, his face contorted with frustration. "Fine," he muttered, barely loud enough for anyone to hear. "Fine. He can stay." Tom didn't move. He didn't react to Ron's begrudging concession. Instead, he turned slightly, his gaze moving back to James, who had been watching the whole exchange in quiet disbelief. "You all right, sir?" Tom asked, his voice softening slightly. James blinked, as if coming out of a daze. He nodded slowly, his voice quiet but steady. "I'm fine. Thank you." Tom nodded, satisfied with the answer, then turned back to Ron. "This man served his country with honor, and whether you like it or not, he's earned the right to sit wherever he damn well pleases." Ron's jaw clenched, but he didn't say anything. His face was red with anger, but he knew better than to push the issue any further. Tom gave him one last hard look before turning away, his expression calm but resolute. He walked back toward the center of the diner, the rest of the bikers following silently behind him. The tension in the room seemed to lift slightly as they moved, the heavy air giving way to something lighter, something more hopeful. James remained by the door for a moment, still processing what had just happened. He had been prepared to leave, to walk away with his head held high, but now things were different. He wasn't sure what to do next. But then, Tom turned back toward him, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Why don't you sit down, sir?" he said, his voice gentle. "Looks like it's time for breakfast." James hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He walked slowly back to his usual booth, the same one by the window where he had sat every morning for years. The rest of the diner seemed to exhale with relief as he took his seat, the tension finally breaking. The bikers took their places at a nearby table, their presence still commanding but less intimidating now. They ordered their food, making small talk amongst themselves, but every now and then, Tom would glance over at James, as if making sure the old man was all right. Ron, for his part, retreated behind the counter, his face set in a permanent scowl. He kept his distance, shooting angry glares toward the bikers every now and then, but he didn't say another word. The power dynamic in the diner had shifted, and he knew it. As James sipped his coffee, the warmth spreading through his chest, he couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet triumph. He had come in that morning prepared to endure another round of insults, another wave of humiliation. But now, things were different. He wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The tension in the diner, which had briefly subsided after the bikers' arrival, returned with a vengeance. Ron stood behind the counter, his face flushed with anger and frustration. His mind raced, unable to process the sudden shift in power. He was used to having control over his diner, over who stayed and who left, but now, with the bikers standing firm and the rest of the diner watching intently, he felt cornered. The bikers, led by Tom, had settled into a nearby booth, their presence still commanding even as they quietly ate their food. But their eyes never strayed far from Ron. The unspoken threat hung in the air, the promise that if he tried anything else, they wouldn't hesitate to act. James sat quietly in his booth by the window, sipping his coffee in silence. His hands trembled slightly as he held the cup, the events of the last few minutes swirling in his mind. He had never expected anyone to stand up for him, much less a group of complete strangers. It felt surreal, almost dreamlike. But as much as he appreciated the biker's support, he could see the storm brewing in Ron's eyes. Ron slammed his hands down on the counter, making the plates rattle. "Enough of this," he shouted, his voice trembling with fury. "I'm not going to let you all come in here and run my business like this. I'm calling the police, and they'll deal with all of you." The threat of involving the police sent a ripple of unease through the diner. A few of the customers shifted in their seats, exchanging nervous glances. No one wanted to see the situation escalate further, but Ron's stubbornness and anger were pushing things in that direction. Tom, however, remained calm. He put his fork down and leaned back in his seat, fixing Ron with a steady gaze. "Go ahead," Tom said coolly. "Call them, but just know this. We'll be recording every second of it. And once we post it online, everyone in this town is going to know exactly who you are and what kind of place you run here." At this, the bikers all reached into their pockets and pulled out their phones. One by one, they started recording. The little red lights on their screens blinked to life, signaling that everything was now being captured. The sound of phones clicking and buzzing filled the diner. Ron froze, his hand halfway to the phone on the counter. His face, already red with anger, now paled as the realization of what Tom was saying sank in. He was no fool. He knew how quickly things could spread on social media. A video of him kicking a veteran out of his diner because of his race? That would be the end of him. His reputation, his business, it would all be ruined. Tom continued, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about us sitting here and eating breakfast. This is about the way you treated a man who served this country, the way you think it's okay to treat him like he doesn't belong here. You think people in this town are going to stand for that? You think they're going to keep coming here when they find out what kind of man you really are?" Ron's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. His eyes darted around the diner, searching for some kind of support, some way out of the mess he had created. But the customers, who had been silent up until now, started to murmur among themselves. "That's right," one older man at a nearby table said, nodding in agreement. "You can't just treat people like that." A woman with her 2 children leaned over her plate, her voice low but firm. "You've been rude to people for too long, Ron. This isn't the first time." Another man, sitting at the counter, looked over his shoulder at Ron and shook his head. "You know, I never thought about it before, but I've seen you act like this a lot. Maybe it's time someone called you out." The support for James was growing, and with it, Ron's fear. He could feel the tide turning against him, and it terrified him. His eyes flicked back to Tom, who was still calmly holding his phone, recording everything. The other bikers hadn't said much, but their silence was more intimidating than words. They stood behind Tom like an immovable wall of support. Ron felt trapped. If he called the police, it would only escalate the situation further, and there was no doubt in his mind that the bikers would make good on their promise to expose him. He could already see the headlines. "Local diner owner kicks out black veteran." It would ruin him. But his pride, his stubbornness, wouldn't let him back down so easily. "I didn't mean it like that," Ron stammered, his voice faltering. "I didn't know he was a veteran. I was just trying to keep things in order here." Tom raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You saw a black man sitting in your diner, and you decided he didn't belong here. That's all this is. And now, you're trying to backtrack because you're scared of what'll happen when people find out." Ron's face flushed with shame. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, suffocating him. He had lost control, and now he was grasping at straws. James, still sitting quietly in his booth, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. He had never imagined that anyone would stand up for him in this way. For years, he had faced this kind of treatment, the quiet discrimination, the subtle and not-so-subtle ways people try to push him out of spaces they didn't think he belonged in. But this was different. For the first time in a long time, James felt seen. He felt defended. And it wasn't just the bikers. It was the other patrons, the people who had spoken up in his defense. It was a strange and powerful feeling, one that left him speechless. "Ron," still reeling from the confrontation, ran a hand through his thinning hair and let out a shaky breath. "Look, I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice weak. "I'm sorry. Okay, I didn't mean to cause all this." But Tom wasn't satisfied with a half-hearted apology. He stood up from the booth and slowly walked over to the counter, standing directly in front of Ron. The two men were now face to face, and the contrast between them was stark. Tom, calm and steady, with the quiet strength of a man who had seen far worse than this, and Ron, flustered and panicking, his facade crumbling before everyone's eyes. "You think saying sorry is enough?" Tom asked quietly, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can treat people like garbage, and then just say a few words and it all goes away?" Ron swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the door, as if considering an escape. But there was no way out. Not anymore. Tom leaned in slightly, his voice dropping even lower. "This isn't just about what you did to James today. This is about every single time you've treated someone like they're less than you. And today you got called out for it." The silence in the diner was deafening. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Ron started to speak, but his voice faltered again. He looked around the diner, his gaze landing on James. There was something in the old man's eyes, something that cut through all of Ron's bluster and bravado. It was quiet, it was calm, but it was powerful. Ron took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "I was wrong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't have treated you like that." James didn't say anything at first. He simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but one that carried a world of meaning. He had no need for a grand apology. The moment spoke for itself. Tom, seeing that Ron had finally backed down, took a step back and turned to James. "You good, sir?" he asked, his tone softening. James nodded again. "I'm good," he said quietly. Tom gave him a small smile, then turned back to Ron. "You've got a lot to think about," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Maybe it's time to start treating people with the respect they deserve." Ron didn't respond. He simply stood there, staring at the floor, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The bikers, sensing that the confrontation was over, put their phones away and returned to their seats, though the tension in the air still lingered. The other patrons slowly began to relax as well, their murmurs dying down as they returned to their meals. But the energy in the diner had shifted. Something had changed. James, still sitting in his booth, took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He had come in that morning expecting the usual, quiet humiliation, another small battle in the long war he had fought his entire life. But instead, he had found something unexpected. He had found people willing to stand up for him, people who refused to let injustice go unchecked. For the first time in a long while, James didn't feel alone. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's main street as James stepped out of his modest home. His weathered hands gripped his cane a little tighter than usual, a testament to the emotional roller coaster of the past few weeks. The events at the diner had sent shockwaves through the small town, rippling out far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. As James made his way down the sidewalk, he noticed the subtle changes in how people greeted him. Where once there had been polite nods or averted gazes, he now saw warm smiles and respectful nods. Mrs. Henderson, watering her plants as always, called out with genuine warmth, "Good morning, Mr. Washington. Beautiful day, isn't it?" James tipped his hat, a small smile playing on his lips. "Indeed it is, Mrs. Henderson. Indeed it is." The change wasn't just in the greetings. James could feel it in the air, a shift in the town's atmosphere. It was as if a heavy veil had been lifted, allowing people to see each other, to truly see each other for the first time in years. As he rounded the corner, James's eyes fell on the empty storefront that had once been Ron's diner. The neon sign had been taken down, leaving behind faded outlines of letters that once welcomed hungry patrons. A "for sale" sign hung in the window, a silent testament to the swift and dramatic fallout from that fateful morning. James paused, leaning on his cane as he gazed at the vacant building. His mind wandered back to the day everything changed, the day a group of bikers had rolled into town and stood up for him when no one else would. The news of the incident had spread like wildfire through Millbrook and beyond. Tom Sanders, the leader of the Iron Veterans MC, had made good on his promise to keep an eye on things. The video of Ron's discriminatory behavior, captured by Jake, his vice president, on his phone, had found its way onto social media platforms and local news stations. The reaction had been swift and decisive. Millbrook residents, many of whom had been present that day but remained silent, found their voices. The local VFW Post, led by Commander Sarah Harrington, had organized a rally in support of James and against discrimination. Hundreds had shown up, holding signs that read, "Respect our veterans," and "No place for hate in Millbrook." Ron Walters, the owner of the diner, had tried to weather the storm at first. He'd issued a half-hearted apology, claiming his words had been taken out of context. But as the days passed and the public outrage grew, his customer base dwindled. Regular patrons, unable to reconcile their love for diner's famous apple pie with the owner's hateful actions, found other places to dine. The final nail in the coffin had been the economic impact. As news of the incident spread beyond Millbrook's borders, tourism took a hit. The town, which relied heavily on its quaint, welcoming image to attract visitors, suddenly found itself branded as a hotbed of racial tension. Local businesses, already struggling in the wake of recent economic downturns, felt the pinch. Within a month, Ron had been forced to close the diner's doors for good. The for sale sign had gone up shortly after, a silent admission of defeat. As James stood there, lost in thought, a familiar rumble filled the air. He turned to see a group of motorcycles approaching, their chrome gleaming in the morning sun. A smile spread across his face as he recognized Tom Sanders leading the pack. The bikers pulled up to the curb, engines cutting off as they dismounted. Tom, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed as always, strode over to James with a wide grin. "Mr. Thompson," he called out, extending his hand. "Good to see you out and about." James clasped Tom's hand warmly. "Good to see you too, Tom. What brings you boys to town?" Tom's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Oh, just passing through. Thought we'd stop by and see how our favorite veteran was doing." James chuckled, shaking his head. "You boys are too much. I'm doing just fine, thanks to you all." The other bikers gathered around, each taking turns to greet James with handshakes and pats on the back. Over the past few weeks, these men had become more than just acquaintances. They had become friends, confidants, and in many ways, the family James had long been missing. Jake, Tom's vice president, nodded towards the empty diner. "Looks like karma finally caught up with old Ron, huh?" James's expression turned thoughtful. "I suppose it did, though I can't say I take any pleasure in seeing a man lose his livelihood." Tom nodded, respect evident in his eyes. "That's why you're a better man than most, Mr. Thompson. But sometimes consequences are necessary for change to happen." As they stood there, a small crowd began to gather. Word had spread quickly that the Iron Veterans MC was back in town, and people were eager to show their support. Martha, the elderly woman who had first spoken up for James that fateful day, approached the group. "Mr. Washington, Tom," she greeted them warmly. "I hope you don't mind the audience. People just wanted to come and say thank you." Tom looked around, surprised by the growing crowd. "Thank you? For what?" A middle-aged man stepped forward, his hand extended. "For opening our eyes," he said simply. "For making us see what was happening right under our noses." More people chimed in, each with their own words of gratitude. James stood there, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. He'd lived in Millbrook for decades, but never had he felt so truly part of the community as he did in that moment. As the impromptu gathering continued, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. A woman in her early 40s stepped out, her crisp suit and confident stride marking her as someone of importance. "Mr. Thompson," she called out, making her way through the crowd. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was hoping I could have a word with you." James turned, curiosity piqued. "Of course, miss." "Carter," the woman supplied, extending her hand. "Alicia Carter. I'm from the mayor's office." A hush fell over the crowd as Alicia continued. "Mr. Washington, in light of recent events, the mayor and the town council would like to extend an invitation. We're organizing a special ceremony to honor our local veterans, and we'd be honored if you would be our keynote speaker." James blinked, taken aback by the request. "Me? Surely there are others more qualified." Tom clapped a hand on James's shoulder. Nonsense. There's no one more qualified than you, Mr. Thompson. You've lived it every step of the way. Alicia nodded in agreement. Exactly. Your experiences, both during your service and here in Millbrook, offer a unique perspective that we believe needs to be heard. James looked around at the expectant faces surrounding him. He saw hope there and a genuine desire for change. Slowly, he nodded. Well, if you think it would help, I'd be honored to speak. A cheer went up from the crowd, and James felt a warmth spread through his chest. For the first time in years, he felt truly seen and valued by his community. As the crowd began to disperse, Tom pulled James aside. Listen, we're having a little gathering at the VFW post next weekend. Sort of a meet and greet for vets of all ages. We'd love it if you'd join us. James smiled, touched by the invitation. I'd like that very much, Tom. Thank you. As James watched Tom and his brothers ride off, the rumble of their engines fading into the distance, he couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed in such a short time. The incident at the diner, painful as it had been, had sparked a transformation in Millbrook. It was as if the town had been shaken awake, forced to confront the subtle prejudices that had long simmered beneath its quaint exterior. In the weeks that followed, James found himself busier than he had been in years. The invitation to speak at the veterans ceremony had been just the beginning. Soon, he was being asked to share his experiences at local schools, community centers, and church groups. At first, James had been hesitant. He'd never considered himself a public speaker, and the thought of addressing large groups made him nervous. But with each engagement, he found his voice growing stronger, his message clearer. He spoke of his time in the service, of the bonds forged in the heat of battle that transcended race or background. He shared stories of the discrimination he'd faced, both during and after his tour of duty. But more than that, he spoke of resilience, of hope, and of the unwavering belief in the fundamental goodness of people. As James's profile in the community grew, so did the respect and admiration of his fellow townspeople. The polite nods he'd once received on his daily walks had transformed into warm greetings and heartfelt conversations. People who had lived alongside him for years were suddenly eager to hear his stories, to learn from his experiences. The local VFW post, once a place James had visited only occasionally, became a second home. Commander Sarah Harrington had made it her personal mission to ensure James felt welcome and valued. The walls of the post now bore photos of James from his service days, alongside those of other local veterans. It was at one of these VFW gatherings that James met young Tommy's grandfather, a fellow Korean War veteran named Frank. The two men, despite having lived in the same town for decades, had never truly connected before. Now, they found themselves swapping stories late into the night, bridging the gap that had long existed between them. You know, James, Frank said one evening, his voice gruff with emotion, I owe you an apology. All these years I never really saw you, never took the time to know you. And that's my loss. James reached out, clasping Frank's shoulder. No apologies needed, Frank. We're here now, and that's what matters. As the weeks turned into months, James found himself at the center of a growing circle of friends and supporters. The Iron Veterans MC, true to their word, made regular trips to Millbrook. Each visit brought new stories, new connections, and a deepening bond between James and the group of bikers who had changed his life. Tom, in particular, had become like a son to James. The gruff biker leader had a soft spot for the elderly veteran, often going out of his way to check in on James or help with odd jobs around the house. You know, Mr. Washington, Tom said one afternoon as they sat on James's porch, I've been thinking. We've got chapters of our MC all over the state. How would you feel about us starting a mentorship program, pairing up younger vets with older ones like yourself? James's eyes lit up at the idea. That sounds wonderful, Tom. There's so much we could learn from each other. The program, which they named Bridges Across Time, quickly gained traction. Veterans of all ages and backgrounds found common ground, sharing experiences and offering support. James, with his quiet wisdom and unwavering compassion, became a favorite mentor among the younger vets. As Millbrook continued to grapple with the aftermath of the diner incident, changes began to take root. The town council, spurred by the public outcry, implemented new diversity and inclusion training for all public employees. Local businesses hung "All are welcome here" signs in their windows, a small but significant gesture of solidarity. The empty storefront that had once been Ron's diner stood as a silent reminder of the town's recent turmoil. For months, the "For Sale" sign hung in the window, a topic of much speculation among the townspeople. Some suggested turning it into a community center. Others proposed a museum celebrating the town's diverse history. It was on a crisp autumn morning, nearly 6 months after the incident, that James noticed a flurry of activity around the old diner. A moving truck was parked out front, and a group of workers were busy carrying in equipment and supplies. Curious, James made his way over, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the sidewalk. As he approached, he saw a young woman directing the movers, her face alight with excitement. "Excuse me," James called out. "I couldn't help but notice all the commotion. Are you the new owner?" The woman turned, a wide smile spreading across her face. "I am indeed. Melissa Johnson, pleased to meet you." She extended her hand, which James shook warmly. "James Thompson. Welcome to Millbrook, Miss Johnson." Melissa's eyes widened in recognition. "Mr. Thompson, I've heard so much about you. It's an honor to meet you, sir." James chuckled, a bit embarrassed by the recognition. "Oh, I'm just an old man who's been around a while. Nothing special." Melissa shook her head emphatically. "I beg to differ, Mr. Thompson. Your story, what happened here, it's part of what inspired me to open my restaurant in Millbrook." James raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Is that so? Well, I'm glad something good came out of that unfortunate business. What kind of restaurant are you opening, if you don't mind my asking?" Melissa's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "It's going to be a fusion restaurant, celebrating the diverse culinary traditions of the South. I want it to be a place where everyone feels welcome, where the food brings people together." As Melissa spoke, James couldn't help but feel a sense of coming full circle. The space that had once been a symbol of division was being transformed into a beacon of unity and diversity. "That sounds wonderful, Ms. Johnson. I look forward to trying it out when you open." Melissa beamed. "I'd be honored, Mr. Thompson. In fact," she hesitated for a moment, then continued, "I was wondering if you might consider being our guest of honor at our grand opening. Your story, your resilience, it embodies everything I want this restaurant to stand for." James was touched by the offer. "I'd be delighted, Ms. Johnson. Thank you." As James made his way home that afternoon, his heart felt lighter than it had in years. The changes in Millbrook, while born from a painful incident, had led to something beautiful. The town he'd called home for so long was finally becoming the welcoming, inclusive community he'd always known it could be. The grand opening of Melissa's restaurant, which she named Harmony Table, became the talk of the town. The event drew people from all walks of life, united in their excitement for the new establishment and what it represented. James, true to his word, attended as the guest of honor. As he cut the ribbon to officially open the restaurant, he looked out at the sea of faces before him. He saw Tom and his biker brothers, standing tall and proud. He saw Frank and the other veterans from the VFW, their eyes shining with respect and camaraderie. He saw young Tommy, now a frequent visitor to James's home for stories and advice, grinning from ear to ear. But more than that, he saw a community united, black and white, young and old, lifelong residents and newcomers, all gathered together in celebration of new beginnings and shared humanity. As James raised his glass for a toast, his voice strong and clear, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. To Harmony Table, he said, and to Millbrook, may this place be a reminder that when we come together, when we see the humanity in each other, there's nothing we can't overcome. The crowd cheered, and as the festivities continued late into the night, James couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The incident at Ron's diner, painful as it had been, had cracked open the shell of complacency that had long encased Millbrook. And in its wake, something beautiful had grown. As he sat at a table, surrounded by friends both old and new, James felt a contentment he hadn't experienced in years. He thought back to that young soldier in the photograph by his bedside, the one who had set out to serve his country with hope and determination. That young man could never have imagined the journey ahead, the challenges he would face, or the impact he would ultimately have. But here he was, 89 years old, finally seeing the change he had long hoped for. It wasn't perfect. James knew that prejudice and ignorance couldn't be eradicated overnight. But it was a start, a stepping stone towards a better future. James' experience of standing up against injustice ignited a powerful transformation, not only for himself but for his entire community and everyone who learns his story. His courage to confront discrimination, even when faced with humiliation, sparked a movement that went beyond personal change. It highlighted the immense power of unity and the importance of advocating for what's right. If James' story resonated with you, be sure to subscribe for more inspiring tales of bravery and solidarity. And before you go, we'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you think you would have reacted if you were in James' situation? Share your reflections in the comments below.